Okay, I want to start by an interesting comment. I typically am the only one talking about open source at financial services conferences. I happen to be now the third in line, and it's the third talk that mentions open source. So I'm pretty excited, to be honest. Maybe we can actually skip some of the slides that would introduce what open source is. But again, it's interesting because our foundation, the Symphony Software Foundation, is an open source foundation, very much focused on financial services. As our name says, very much focused on the Symphony messaging platform. And my pitch has been to our members that, by the way, you can see here, it's been that open source is something that they need to start engaging on, not just at the developer level, but at strategy level. And so to me, it's really interesting to hear, again, large firms like Microsoft or talking about, recruiting needs that open source can solve. Just a quick intro on us. Our foundation was created about 2 years ago. I'm running it now for a year. We are seeing a massive momentum now. And the reason why the foundation was created alongside the Symphony endeavor, which many of you are probably familiar with, we are an independent, non-profit, open source foundation created by the very same end users and investors of Symphony to really make sure that that would become an open ecosystem. And that doesn't mean only the usual sort of vendor lock-in prevention, which probably many of you are familiar in open source. But as we're talking about interoperability today, I figured it was important to focus on the ecosystem, open ecosystem that these firms wanted to create on the Symphony platform. And so what we'll do today is just quickly, about 2-3 hours should be, I don't think you guys are going to fall asleep, will you? Just touch on how open standards have been sort of the usual way enterprise will try not to reinvent the wheel. And my thesis is that especially if you're building a platform, open standards are not enough. You need to add the open source component. And I'm going to sort of bring some examples as to how these two worlds are colliding. And especially if you are in financial services, clearly we would love to see you participating in our foundation. So just quickly, since we are an interoperability conference, how many of you have participated in defining a standard, in a standard body? Or a working group? Good. About 10 people. How many did enjoy that? Nick, I knew you would. I knew you would. But okay, we're about at 10%. And so just park that for a second. Obviously, like many things, open standards were not invented by the software engineering, were borrowed, like waterfall methodologies, for example, by other engineering. And again, I always bring the threading, bolts threading standardization as a way that, has really changed the very building blocks of our productivity. And a couple of elements here. Certainly, open standards that are very much industry-driven, are very much top-down. Oftentimes, they're waterfall. But like in this case, when the ultimate end user, so either the worker that could reuse these tools across multiple vendors, as well as the ultimate end user who will not be locked in to that one specific vendor, well, we see how open standards, despite top-down and waterfall, they actually stick. And so it's no surprise that software engineering, network engineering, and more familiar to us, especially after the browser wars. So yeah, clearly, at every level of the stack, we have identified how open standards can, solve some of the key interoperability problems that we've seen. But I don't want to limit this to technology. I think patterns of communication have, in a way, some of the same objectives, especially when I was studying and I learned, design patterns. They might be now surpassed, some argue, but certainly created a common language, that lingua franca, that in many other endeavors, like, for example, the Tower of Babel, had driven the endeavor, the business, to failure. I always come up with this example as I've worked in open source and open standards, because interestingly, again, was a real business need that sort of failed because of the lack of a common standard. But it seems like a real good problem to solve, to the point that thousands of years later, people tried again. And what happened? Well, I think I was reading on Wikipedia, there's probably less than 1 million people speaking Esperanto. There's probably billions of people speaking English. And that shows how, at times, a top-down, disconnected from the actual end user approach will not yield the results that, in principle, were perfectly valid. Now, if maybe they had the blueprint open source of the Babelfish, maybe there would have been another outcome. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But, as I used to be a techie and I'm now a CEO, I need to show my tech street cred sometimes. We touched on technology, we touched on communication. I think politics is another element where, top-down solution and standards have been tried. Well, certainly, again, the lack of buy-in in certain cases from the individuals clearly created some havoc in the actual implementation of these standards. But the reason I bring this up is that there's another, I would say, common pitfall or limitation in what open standards can achieve per se. And it's, the European Union, despite the dream was amazing, I think that, again, while the United States was very much bottom-up, Europe was a top-down, super imposed structure on Europe, and it quickly ended up in so many partial standard implementation, partially overlapping. And that's where, as you guys have worked on standards, the actual implementation of these standards, when you actually go and work against the standard, you realize that the devil is in the details. The standard might be perfect on paper, but, certain vendors might partially implement it. And I'm especially referring to Microsoft V1. Just park that for a second. I mean, very much pre-Satya. But I worked in web technologies. I worked in content management standards. The standard were implemented, up to the 99%. But that 1% would pretty much make the standard unusable. And so, by the way, if you were wondering, the devil is in the details, that's the detail that I was referring to. And so, just to recap, standards are great. Open standardization process is amazing, but it's often waterfall, can lack of stickiness if the end user is not bought in, and suffers from the quasi-standard, from limited standard implementations. So, repeating the question, how many of you have used or contributed to open source projects? How many enjoyed it? See, so I guess that goes to my point that the open source started as an individual movement, started as people that cared about freedom of information, cared about things that were very close to their heart, very close to their conscience. And so it's natural that people enjoy working in open source. Nevertheless, over the last 10, 15 years, based on a less fundamentalist approach to open source and on a much more commercially friendly license, we have seen the proliferation, as I was saying, of much more enterprise-driven projects. Again, the Apache Software Foundation is a very much individually run foundation. The enterprises had to go and work the way the individuals wanted, the way the community decided. But we can see how this massive investment have driven really the biggest innovations over the last 10, 15 years. Now, proliferation is great, but on the other hand, that created a massive conundrum for enterprises to decide on which projects they should invest on. That's a big question, and it's not an easy answer. I'm borrowing this slide from Jim Zemlin, the CEO of the Linux Foundation, who shows how fundamental is to pick the right open source projects, not only to consume, but also to contribute to, especially if you're putting investment. Not every open source project is great. Not every open source project is worth investing in. Projects with a real ecosystem are the ones that you want to invest on. And interestingly, I was at the Linux conference 2 weeks ago, and they were talking exactly about how the Node project, before the Node.js Foundation came around, was actually losing momentum, was actually losing active committers that would bring into the level of the ecosystem that is now. So, and that's where, obviously, as I was saying, foundations come into play. Foundations like the Symphony Software Foundation. So it's no surprise that the Microsoft V2, the Microsoft that we know nowadays, joined the Linux Foundation, and it's growing massively their engagement in open source. So just to have a couple of takeaways. An individually driven movement has moved towards the enterprise, so it's not fair to say anymore that open source is not enterprise friendly. But it's certainly difficult to keep cohesion and to keep connection to the value that an enterprise needs to achieve. Open standards are much more top-down. It's very easy to say, okay, those are business cases, that's what we want, go implement it. Well, open source is much more bottom-up. It's difficult to manage. So, the good news is that the two worlds are colliding. Specifically, on one hand, open source bring to open standards the individual buy-in. On the other hand, open standards bring to open source that connection to the business value. I have lived this firsthand in implementing standards like content management interoperability services, which did not get any traction until there was an actual open source implementation in Apache. The Linux Foundation is moving to this. We have platforms that cover pretty much any level of the stack, as the speakers before me were hinting to, but they are creating more and more vertical working groups or standards or industry-specific initiatives to standardize not only the software, but the process and all the non-functional aspects that, they need to be aligned to what all these very much enterprise-powered foundations, because if you look at these foundations, they're all very much funded by large corporations. And so really they ensure that not only functionally wise, projects deliver what they need. And so I'll close sort of referring to our experience in the Symphony Software Foundation. We have a full stack of components. By now we have about 50 open source projects. The Symphony platform is being incrementally contributed. On top of it, we have an integration framework, we have API clients, we have bots, and we have obviously desktop containers. But we have started working groups to standardize how the APIs would look like, to standardize how containers connect, how apps and Symphony connects to multiple containers to make sure that, again, there is interoperability in the ecosystem, to make sure that the objects that we pass across the whole stack are agreed to the broadest, if you want, constituents of our ecosystem. And obviously security being a fundamental element in our ecosystem. And so I want to close with my thesis that especially if you're implementing a platform, open source and open standard is the way to go. You're going to get buy-in from developers while you're going to make sure that your platform can interoperate through open standards with the maximum amount of platform possible. And so wherever you are in your open source engagement process, whether you are consuming, you are contributing, or you are joining a foundation, well, we'd love to help you out. And there certainly is no cost attached to it. Come and talk at our booth. The maturity of engaging in open source is something that especially financial services is building right now. And so we feel we can play a really important role to help the whole ecosystem embracing open source and open standards. Thank you so much, and apologies for